Hi, welcome back. If you recall, a couple of weeks ago, I released the first part of my audio novel, titled The Muse. It was about a guy called Robert DeLisle, who was transformed by a demon into a mythical creature. As a result of this major alteration, Robert's features kept on changing. It was as if his face had some sort of enchanted perceptual filter. Well, this week we have the concluding part of that story, finally, and I am proud to share it with all you lovely people, so please stay tuned. If you recall, in last week's episode, I uploaded the story of Robert DeLisle, a young man who went to Paris to explore the city's gay scene. He was taken in by a man who, as it turned out, was a demon named Kronos. Kronos altered Robert's physical biology with his preternatural powers and turned Robert into a creature known as a Muse. And then he left Robert to pretty much fend for himself. Luckily, another Muse discovered Robert and decided to nurse him back to health. Asru, the beautiful Muse, told Robert about his heritage and about the various other things he would need to know in order to survive in his new form. Okay, so stay tuned. The second chapter is on the way.
We both went out around about 8 in the evening. I was excited, I had to admit. I also had to admit to myself, at least, that this was the very first time in my life I felt comfortable in my own body. I was a catch, a stunner in tailored clothing. I had never felt this good in all my days. I was a Muse now, with breeding. And if the truth be told, even the girls excited me. I wanted to try it all. I wanted to drink, dance, and fall in love time and time again. I had the pick of anyone I fancied. The old human me would have denied himself these thoughts. The old me would have shied in some corner somewhere and would not have been noticed by anyone. Not the new me, though. Not a bit of it. I felt so alive. Asru went to the bar and left me to my own devices. She must have realized I would have needed some space. I looked about me, weighing up the talent in the room. Like I said, I liked the girls, but I honestly liked the guys more. Such animal attraction. The beautiful strength and the masculine contours of their bodies. The ones with the bad boy haircuts really drove me to distraction, and their eyes as they noticed me joining the activity. Outstanding. I knew it wouldn't be long before at least one of them moved on me. A guy had removed his shirt and began gyrating his hips behind me, wrapping his strong arms around me. I smelled his aftershave and it smelled as sweet as passion. A second guy came over and then I had two dancing for my affections. What a night this was. I admit I have gotten a little tipsy. Okay, all bullshit aside, I got very tipsy. I woke up the next morning with a hangover. Even worse was the fact that I woke up somewhere that I could not identify. Not the first time this has happened, granted. I took in a sharp breath as my eyes scanned the room. Feeling rather panicked, I shot up in bed. It was then I noticed I was fully clothed. Where was I? What was I doing here? I got up and went to the door on the opposite side of the room. Looking out, I saw a landing and some stairs to the left. I went out onto the landing. Gingerly, my heart was pounding in my chest. I did not like this feeling at all. As I walked to the end of the landing, I heard a man's voice and looked down over the banister. And there, in a sizable living space, stood a young, hot redhead dressed in a white dressing gown, holding a paper in one hand and a mug in the other. "You're awake," he said. "Yes, I am," I said a little awkwardly. Where am I?" He smiled. "You're here. This is my flat. You were out last night, if you remember. You had a skinful and you kept asking for someone called Asru? Then the security guy walked to chunk you out. I thought you were in no condition to get yourself back to wherever it was you were staying. So I drove you back here, and I got the extra guest room ready for you." "I see." was all I could muster at that moment, and thank you. I'm Hugo, by the way. He introduced himself finally. What's your name? Robert, I answered, rubbing my brow gingerly. Okay, Robert. Why don't you come downstairs? Sit down, make yourself at home, and I'll get you a drink. What do you want, tea? Coffee? I asked for a coffee and aspirin, if he had one. While Hugo was in the kitchen, I began checking out his place. His pictures he had hung on the wall, his wooden carvings on the table, all seemed to envision a tone of homoeroticism. Then there was his bookshelf that was filled with novels, with titles like The Lord Won't Mind, Giovanni's Room, and Call Me By Your Name, and The Seagulls. And there amidst all these modern titles was Oscar Wilde's collected works. It's a good read, especially the novel. The only novel Oscar wrote, actually. I turned my head and there he was, standing with my coffee and an aspirin for my damned headache. I picked the remedy from his open palm and swallowed it with the aid of the hot beverage. Thank you, Hugo, I said, smiling. That's quite all right, Robert, he replied. Or would you prefer Bobby? Why would I prefer that? I hate the name. Hugo tilted his head and shrugged. It suits you. I think it sounds sweet. I don't, I asserted, looking like I had heard something ludicrous. Okay, Robert it is. But I think old Oscar there may disagree with you on that point. Why? Know him personally, did you? I asked glibly. Oh, intimately, he told me with an emerging smile, letting me know he was intentionally having me on. In fact, I'm in the throes of writing a biography on him, as well as piecing together a lecture on his many post-humanist works. For example, I absolutely adore his novel, The Portrait of Dorian Gray. Ever read it? I told him I hadn't, but I was eager to, though, at that point, which was to say I was eager to agree on anything so long as it kept me close to Hugo. I had begun to take such a shine to his handsome appearance. And yes, I did find his intelligence and confidence quite a turn-on. What's it about? I asked. It's about a boy called Gray who had his portrait painted of him by a close friend of his. But every year that passes, for every sin that young Gray commits, his portrait takes on a life of its own. It becomes wholly animated, adopting all the scars, the blemishes, and the bruises, even the ravishes of old age, turning into the most wicked, twisted, evil portrait in existence. While the young Dorian Gray himself remained youthful and beautiful and innocent for decades, his own painting bore all the dreadful hallmarks of evil and decadence. Gray would have lived forever as an ageless immortal. So, what happened? I asked. Fear and guilt got the better of him. He destroyed the painting and, in so doing, destroyed himself. The enchantment was lifted, and young Mr. Gray simply aged and died. I hated the thought of that. In fact, it was the very thought of Oscar's portrayal of guilt and an enchanted youth that made me think about my own strange situation. Had I not been made immortal by the touch of a craftsman's hand, it would not have bothered me as much. But I felt guilty of so much. Had my portrait been hanging in some hidden room somewhere, would I not have taken the torch to it and set it on fire, breaking the curse forever, like young Gray had? You don't have to look so worried, he told me finally and laughed. It's only a story. No, I smiled a little awkwardly. I've been going through some problems at the moment, and then waking up in a stranger's house this morning. I really don't remember what happened last night. You don't have to explain. We all get drunk from time to time. You're quite safe here, by the way. I felt an overwhelming feeling come over me suddenly. I moved over to embrace him. I actually did feel pretty safe, to be honest. And loved. It was about 11 in the morning by the time I reached Asru's. I was feeling happy, elated even. I came away with a phone number and a promise. I was going to see him this afternoon at the Père Lachaise Cemetery. Not a conventional location for a first date, but it was one of the places I had wanted to visit whilst here, and Hugo wanted to show me the tomb of Oscar Wilde. Asru, my friend, cupped her hands together in delight when I told her. She was not surprised to learn that Hugo was indeed an artist, a writer. She said that it was the afflatus that had beckoned me to him. It happens to all muses. We are drawn by nature to art and the afflatus. which she described as the energy all artists generate in their passion. I must confess that I had become so wrapped in my new existence that I had forgotten for a time that I had lived as a human, and that my old life was still very much an obligatory cause for much anxiety and regret. My father must have been beside himself with worry by now, wondering if I was going to return home. There were more than a dozen missed calls on my phone so far, all from my dad. But I would not accept the call. How could I explain what had happened? How could I begin to tell him that I wasn't even the same person anymore? Hell, I wasn't even the same species. I didn't mean to sound glib, but wasn't it the truth? I didn't want to dwell on consequences. I wanted to be free from pain, free from guilt. I wanted to fall head over heels in love. Was this selfishness? Was I a bad person for letting the people who loved me suffer like this? I looked at the phone beside me for a moment. Then I took it in my hand and chucked it in the waste bin. I needed a new phone anyway, as well as a new number. It had turned 5 in the afternoon as I approached the cemetery. Hugo was standing, waiting for me there, and we embraced each other like lovers. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said to me and smiled. "Why?" I asked. "Well, I believed I was out of your depth and you'd probably change your mind about meeting me." "Don't be silly," I told him. "You are nothing of the kind. If anything, I was worried I was a little out of your depth. I guess I haven't really been feeling myself lately." I saw the look of concern in the twinkle of his eyes. "Family troubles, I guess," I said with a smile. I know those. A few years back, my father and I had a big argument and he shut me out. Do you know what it was over? Subject matter. He could never stomach the fact that I was gay, but the fact that I wrote about sex was probably the final nail in the family coffin. After I brought my first boyfriend home, he threw me out. What can I say? He was a total art critic. He gave a hoot of laughter which was short and full of bitter irony, but he recovered as he looked me in the eye finally. Sometimes it's just best to take all that guilt, bullshit, wrap it in a blanket, and just toss it away where it belongs. Because in the long run, it'll do you no good. I nodded my reply straight away. For the first time, it felt like I had found someone who understood me. For a second, I didn't want to hold back. For a split second, I wanted to tell him everything that was going on in my life. But I couldn't. Could I? And I wanted my Hugo to accept me for what I was. Why? Because I felt like that he understood. I wanted desperately to believe. I wanted to think I could hold nothing back and that he would accept it without condition. But this was merely a fantasy, and I knew it. We went on talking as we entered the cemetery. This place was full of beautiful stone architecture and carvings. The Gothic stillness and silence here were married to the sense that one felt alive and creative, as well as the feeling that one was much in the flow of it all. It was as though every literary vampire had knelt and had brooded here at some point, and Oscar's tomb was no less amazing. It was a large carved stone with what looked like a dozen or so kisses had been planted on its surface. He put his arm around me as we stood, admiring the thing. You know, Hugo began, Jacob Epstein, the artist who came up with this design, had originally envisioned 2 young men with their heads down in grief, looking at the empty stele. But Epstein disregarded that in lieu of this design. Thank you for coming with me today, I told Hugo suddenly. I've really enjoyed your company. That's quite all right, he said, looking intently at my eyes, holding my chin gently between thumb and index finger. He drew ever closer. I closed my eyes as our lips met. We stood and we kissed for what seemed like forever. It felt like the most natural thing. It was as though I instinctively knew what to do next, and it was more than sexual. More than what humans felt when aroused. I discovered the call of his afflatus, and he was willing to empty it, to give it freely to me, like it was his to sacrifice. What is the afflatus? Putting it simply, it is the energy that is derived by thought, feeling, and dream. It's more than simply an abstract. It was the power given substance by his heart, his feelings, and his fertile imagination. I alone could see the energy of the afflatus as it emerged from the pores of his skin, entering me, feeding me the life force I needed. He was the artist. I was his muse. In this world, it fit together like two perfect shapes. Our lips finally parted, and in that broken connection there remained a sacred bond, deeper than the seas and older than time. I felt like I was no longer new. I was humbled by the timeless majesty of it all. Midnight approached and we parted ways. We agreed to meet up again. There was a small amusement park which was to be our next location for a date. I walked away smiling, feeling that the world was a perfect place. As I passed through a residential area, my attentions were drawn suddenly to an open window, 2 flights up. I noticed the net curtains gently moving in the breeze. A baby was crying. That was when I felt the next step of my natural behavior, like it was calling to me. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still in the street. A solitary streetlight offered enough illumination for the afflatus I had collected to ascend to its target. It raised from my skin like a cool vapor, climbing higher and higher, then entered the open window into the room where that child lay crying. After a few moments, there was no sound at all. The young child had taken what I had collected and had absorbed it fully. This, I had come to realize, was the task of the Muse. This was our legacy. We were like bees collecting the pollen and spreading it to the garden, offering it fresh growth. The child would take the afflatus, freshly plucked, and would later develop, becoming perhaps the next Picasso or the next Rembrandt or Muller. Maybe one day he or she would grow into the next musician or sculpt artist. Most important, he or she would shine and pass the torch to a new generation. This was the true power of the afflatus. When I got home that night, I dreamed happy dreams of every good thing I had accomplished. There was truth in my being, and the fruits of it outweighed any lingering guilt I may have harbored. I was now one of the Muses, a creature of weight, an angel of worth. In the end, was that not what it was all about? Living and finding validation in your life? I woke the next day feeling rested. I got dressed, went down the stairs, and said good morning to Asru. "Coffee?" she asked as she waited for the kettle to boil. "You were out late last night. Do anything nice?" "Please," I answered, and I wasn't out all that late. Anyway, Hugo and I just walked and talked most of the night. He really is a lovely guy. "You'll have to invite him round one of these days. See if he gets Aunt Asru's approval," she smiled. "He gave me the afflatus," I told her without further hesitation. "I have experienced it, Asru, and it was the most perfect thing." She put down her coffee mug and came up to me, throwing her arms round me. "Oh, I knew you would, girl. He's definitely the one for you then. Oh, I'm so happy for you." I felt elated. For the first time in my whole life, I felt like I was somebody, a plus and not a minus. She stepped away from me and she looked me up and down admiringly. "I knew you had potential." Later, I took a taxi to the amusement park where Hugo had said he'd meet me. I was so excited to see his face. I spied him amidst the crowds of people. He was walking towards me. I was about to smile and say something as he approached, but then he did the most unexpected thing. He walked past me, and not only did he just blank me, he shrugged past, scuffing my shoulder as he went. It was as though I was not even standing there. I turned around to view him as he carried on walking. What was going on? I followed him. He was looking this way and then that as he went. Then he stopped, turned. It was as though he was frustrated looking for someone. But I was here, just a few meters away from him. Why didn't he see me? I could feel my heart crumbling into tiny pieces. I felt the tension and panic rise up in the weight of my back. I caught my reflection suddenly in one of those funhouse mirrors. Oh my god, I thought. My face. My features had altered again. The tears began to pour down my cheeks as I looked back one last time at my dear Hugo. But he was gone, wasn't he? I walked, feeling quite dazed and alone. The noises of the amusement park, its raucous music, its machinery, as well as the loud talk of its patrons, all seemed to ebb into white background noise, becoming one hallucination of sound and energy, crying like a vile sickness in the afterthoughts of my mind. I felt paralyzed inside, unable to breathe or find solace in anything I had accomplished, because now I had lost, hadn't I? And this loss had brought to light all my other losses I had experienced throughout my life and had bundled them all into one sack and made myself cry. When it was over, I found myself again in a silent, darkened street. No one else was around. I leant against the wall, sank to the floor, and I cried and I cried. I thought I would never stop. Looking up at the night sky, I saw those indifferent stars above, looking down, but not one of them noticed or cared. Stars are indifferent. That, I believe, is how they continue to burn so bright. It's because they don't care. They don't care about the negative void with which their light is given form. They just burn and are content to let things be. It was all part of a whole, a process in which all things had its purpose. But I had been separated from it, hadn't I? I was no longer part of it, or anything. I had been cast out. I was no longer part of the whole. There was no yielding force to prop me up any longer or give me substance. I really felt so lost. And I had never felt so afraid in my life. And then I noticed it, an odd shape moving amidst the blackness above. I wiped the tears staining my eyes so that I could see what it was. It was a strange, long object, flat like a child's kite, with fins and sails. It floated gracefully like a large manta ray sailing in the night's breeze. What on earth could it have been? I felt an intense curiosity as I rose to my feet. My eyes were still drawn aloft. There was something mysterious about this object. But it was not an object. It was not inanimate because it flew in patterns, and patterns suggested intentions. I gave it much scrutiny, and that feeling came over me, like a memory awaking in my thoughts. I knew that shape in the sky. I had never seen it before, but something about it seemed familiar to me somehow. I instantly thought of Kronos, the devil who had made me into this creature, this Muse, this thing without a life or substance. I loosened my large black wings. These two feathered pennons re-emerged from my back and carried my body into the night's clear ether. That strange object began to fly gracefully away from me. I tried reaching out with my hand and my thoughts, but it was as though this strange being was trying to lure me somewhere, or away from something. And all I wanted was answers. For hours I flew in pursuit of this fanciful creature. Then it disappeared, like an illusion. It was gone. And with it, all my desires for an answer to my riddle. I fell from the sky, finally exhausted. I had expended too much of my energy. I landed in the middle of a field, right slap bang in the middle of nowhere, not knowing where I was. It was twilight, and the peacocks were playing their eerie symphony.
Very sad. Well, that is the end of this story presently, but there will definitely be more to come. Hope you enjoyed my short audio novel. If you did, then please like and subscribe to my channel. I'll be back next Monday. See you later.